The spill was not an accident. Clara knew it with the chilling certainty of a woman long accustomed to the subtle mechanics of cruelty. One moment, she was a ghost at the edge of the glittering ballroom, a drab moth drawn to a galaxy of merciless stars. The next, she was the center of it all, drenched in claret, from shoulder to hem. The wine, dark as blood, soaked through the thin muslin of her thrice-mended gown, clinging coldly to her skin. A footman, pale and stammering apologies, fumbled with a fallen silver tray. But Clara's eyes were not on him. They were on her aunt, Lady Beatrice, whose lips were pressed into a thin, triumphant line. Laughter, at first, a titter and then a wave, washed over her. It was the sound of her own humiliation, amplified by the flawless acoustics of the Earl of Densmorea's ballroom. She stood frozen, a statue carved from mortification, the cold of the spilled wine seeping into her bones. Her dress, a pale gray, she had spent weeks altering from one of her aunt's cast-offs, was ruined. More than the dress, the moment was ruined. Her, one evening out of the oppressive quiet of her aunt's townhouse, her one night to breathe air that was not thick with disapproval, was now this. A spectacle? Oh, you clumsy girl. A Lady Beatricia's voice cut through the noise, dripping with a false sympathy that was sharper than any overt insult. She glided forward, her silks rustling like dry, whispering leaves. Always in the way. Look at you. An absolute fright. Clara said nothing. There was nothing to say. A poor relation, a companion taken in a hout of cherry phrase her aunt deployed with the precision of a duelist's blade, did not have the luxury of a response. Her role was to be useful, to be silent, and above all, to be invisible. Tonight, she had failed spectacularly at the latter. She could feel the stares, the smirks of the other young women, the pitying glances of the older matrons. Pity was the worst of it. It was a coin, tossed to a beggar, acknowledging her lowly state without offering any true aid. She simply curtsied, a small, stiff movement. If you will excuse me, Aunt." Her voice was a thread, but it did not tremble. She had learned long ago to pack all her feelings into a small, locked box, deep inside her chest. To show hurt was to give her aunt a victory. As she turned to make her escape, to find some back stairwell where she could disappear, a presence blocked her path. It was a man, tall and broad-shouldered, and the entire ballroom seemed to go still and silent in his wake. He was a pillar of black, superfine and stark white linen in a sea of color, his stillness a rebuke to the room's frivolous motion. The Duke of Harrowmere. Clara had seen him earlier, a formidable solitary figure watching the dancers with an expression of profound boredom. He was spoken of in hushed, reverent tone, possibly wealthy, impossibly powerful, and, since the death of his Duchess 2 years prior, impossibly remote. Grief, it was said, had hollowed him out and left a man of cold duty in its place. He noticed things, people whispered. He noticed a crooked painting, a discontented tenant, a lie told across a card table. Now, his unnervingly direct gaze was fixed on her. He did not speak to her aunt. He did not address the gawking crowd. He simply moved, shrugging out of his immaculate evening coat. The gesture was fluid, economical, and utterly commanding. Before Clara could process what was happening, he had draped the heavy weight of it over her shoulders. The coat was a shock. It was warm from his body, smelling faintly of cold, night air, expensive wool, and something clean and masculine, like sandalwood. It enveloped her, the fine, dark wool, a stark contrast to her ruined, flimsy gown. A fortress. The hem brushed her ankles. For a woman of her modest height, it was like being wrapped in a banner. The room held its breath. A duke did not give his coat to a drenched nobody. He finally looked at her, his eyes a startlingly clear gray, the color of a winter sky. They were not cold, as she had expected, but weary. They took in the wine stain, the trembling she could not quite suppress, the defiant set of her jaw. "Allow me, he said. His voice was low, a quiet rumble that carried no further than her ears. Then he turned his head slightly, his profile sharp as a blade against the candlelight. His cousin, a florid man named Mr. Finch, had bustled up, his expression one of bewilderment. Your Grace." The girla, the Duca's, reply was quiet, dismissive, and it struck Clara with the force of a physical blow. It is a simple kindness, Finch." "The girl is cold." He paused, and his gaze swept the room, daring anyone to make more of it. "She wann't be remembered here by morning. She wann't be remembered here." The words went through her like a shard of ice. He had not meant them for her, she knew. He had meant them for the gossips, for his cousin, for the entire glittering, cruel assembly. It was a deflection, a social maneuver to dismiss the event, and her with it, as utterly insignificant. A way to protect her, perhaps. But what she heard was the plain, unvarnished truth of her own existence. She was forgettable, a smudge on the evening, soon to be wiped away. His kindness was an impulse, his coat alone, and his assessment of her, brutally accurate. Lady Beatrice looked apoplectic, her face a mask of fury that her carefully staged humiliation had been so thoroughly upstaged. She opened her mouth to protest, but the Duke spoke again, his voice now carrying a hint of steel that silenced the entire room. "I will see Miss Ashford home." It was not a request, it was a decree. He offered Clara his arm as if she were the finest lady in the room, as if she were not wearing his ridiculously oversized coat over a ruined gown. Her hand, when she placed it on his sleeve, was shaking. She could feel the hard muscle beneath the fine fabric. He did not seem to notice, or if he did, he gave no sign. He led her from the ballroom, the crowd parting before them like the Red Sea. No one spoke, no one dared. The only sound was the rustle of his coat against the floor, and the frantic, terrified beating of her own heart. He had rescued her, yes, but his rescue was a pronouncement of her own nothingness. He had wrapped her in the finest wool, only to declare her invisible. And the crime, the thing that made her chest ache with a pain sharper than any spilled wine, was that he was right. She would not be remembered. The carriage ride was a study in silence. The Duke of Harrowmere sat opposite her, a formidable shape in the darkness, the faint light from the passing street lamps catching the severe lines of his face. Clara was intensely aware of the coat still wrapped around her, a heavy, warm weight of obligation. She should have been grateful, and she was, but underneath the gratitude was the stinging echo of his words. He had not asked for her direction. The carriage, his carriage, simply moved with purpose through the London streets. She supposed his man had been given instructions by Mr. Finch, or someone else. Her aunt's house was respectable, if not grand. Your aunt seems a formidable woman," the Duke said at last, his voice startling her. Clara kept her eyes on her own hands, twisting a loose thread on the borrowed coat. She values propriety, Your Grace." It was the most neutral thing she could think to say. It was also a lie. Her aunt valued power, and Clara was a convenient subject on which to exercise it. A propriety is often the name we give to cruelty. "We cannot be bothered to forbid," he observed, his tone flat. He was not looking at her, but out the window, at the blur of the city. He noticed things. He had noticed the malice in her aunt's voice, the triumph in her eyes. The thought was strangely unnerving. The carriage slowed, but it was not her aunt's street. It stopped before a modest but well-kept townhouse, one she did not recognize. A footman opened the door. The Duke inclined his head. My solicitor's residence." "I have found it is often better to discuss business on neutral ground." "A business!" The word came out as a squeak. Your Grace, I believe there is a misunderstanding. I have no business with you. I am merely grateful for your assistance." You were publicly humiliated," he stated, as if it were a fact. From a ledger. Your aunt engineered it. Your dress is ruined. Your position in that household is now untenable. These are the facts. Are they not? She could only nod her throat tight. Then we have business, he said, and stepped out of the carriage. He did not wait to see if she would follow. He simply expected it. Every instinct screamed at her to flee, to take his magnificent coat back to her aunt's house and face the inevitable storm. To enter this house with this man felt like stepping off a cliff. But then she thought of her aunt's face, of the years of small grinding cruelties, of the laughter in that ballroom. Her life there was already a slow fall. Perhaps a cliff was a faster way down. She gathered the heavy folds of the coat and followed him. The solicitor, a dry, bird-like man named Mr. Hemlock, showed them into a study that smelled of paper and beeswax. A fire crackled in the hearth. He stood before the fire, his back to it, his shadow long and imposing. I require a wife, Miss Ashford, he said, without preamble. I require one before the quarter is end. My late wife's trustees are concerned about my son. About the state of Harrowmere. They believe the house needs a duchess to restore order. They are threatening to interfere with my guardianship of my own heir. Clara stared at him speechless. This was madness. He was a duke. He could have his pick of any debutante in London. You are wondering why I am asking you, he continued, his gray eyes missing nothing of her shock. The answer is practical. I have no time for courtship, for the simpering and games of the season. I have watched you this evening, before the incident. You were not flirting, you were not gossiping, you were observing. You mended the lace on Lady Annalisea's hem when it tore, and you did it so discreetly, she never even knew you were there. You calmed a servant who was about to drop a tray of glasses. You possess a stillness that is rare. I find I am in great need of stillness. He was cataloguing her. She realized he had seen all the moments she had thought herself invisible. He had seen her usefulness. My son, Arthur, is 7 years old. The Duke went on, his voice losing a fraction of its iron control. Has not been well since his mother's death. He is silent. He has driven away 3 governesses. The house itself is a cold. It needs a firm, quiet hand. It needs a mistress, not a society belle who requires constant entertainment, but a chatelaine, a manager. He paused. You need a home. I need a duchess. It is a transaction that would appear to benefit us both. A transaction. The word was as cold and hard as a diamond. He was not offering her a fairy tale. He was offering her a position, duchess, as household manager. The words she was supposed to say died on her lips. The grateful acceptance, the tearful thanks. Instead, another voice, one she had kept locked away for years, spoke. It was quiet, but it was clear. A no, she said. The Duke's eyebrows, which she had thought permanently fixed in a line of aristocratic hauteur, rose a fraction of an inch. Even Mr. Hemlock looked up from his papers. No, the Duke repeated as if the word were a foreign language. Clara's heart was hammering against her ribs, but she met his gaze. The borrowed coat felt less like a shield now, and more like armor. She had earned the right to wear. I will not enter your house. As a decoration, your grace. I will not be a ghost in a new home ignored until I am needed to sign a menu or sit at the end of a dinner table. You say you need a duchess. What you have described is a head housekeeper with a title. She took a breath. The air tasting of fire and courage. If I am to do this. And I have not yet said I will. I will have conditions. For the first time since she had met him, the Duke of Harrowmere looked genuinely surprised. A flicker of something interest, respecta, moved in the depths of his gray eyes. State them first, she said, her voice gaining strength. I will have the truth, all of it. About your son, about the trustees, about the state of the house. I do not bargain with half a story. Second, I will have full and uncontested authority over the household. The nurseries, the kitchens, the staff, the accounts, all of it. My word will be law within the walls of Harrowmere. The staff will answer to me. And, to me, alone. She saw a muscle tighten in his jaw, but he nodded. Go on. A third, she said, her voice softening slightly. Your late wife. She will not be erased. Her portrait will not be taken down and put in an attic. Her memory will be honored. Your son has lost his mother. He should not be made to feel he must forget her to please his new stepmother. I will not be a replacement. I will be an addition. The silence that followed was profound. The fire crackled. Mr. Hemlock had stopped pretending to write and was watching them, his mouth slightly agape. Clara had laid her terms before the most powerful man in the county as if she were the one with the dukedom. The Duke was watching her, his expression unreadable. He had seen her as a solution, a quiet, biddable piece to solve the puzzle of his life. He was now seeing something else entirely. A woman who, despite being drenched in wine and disgrace, knew her own worth. Ah, she had a fondness for the morning sun in the East Wing, he said, his voice quiet. We closed it after she passed. It has been closed for 2 years. Eddie was not an agreement, it was a confession. It was the first piece of the truth she had demanded. Then, my first act as Duchess of Harrowmere, Clara said, her voice steady. Will be to open the curtains. He held her gaze for a long moment, and in the depths of his eyes she saw the shift. He was no longer looking at a problem to be solved. He was looking at a person, Mr. Hemlock. The Duke said, his voice resonating with a new finality. Draw up the settlement. The conditions are acceptable. He had inherited more debts of feeling than of money, and had discharged both badly. This, Crispin knew. Harrowmere, the estate that had been in his family for 400 years, was a testament to it. It was not crumbling, not in the way of houses with profligate masters. It was perfectly maintained, clinically clean, and as cold and silent as a tomb. Grief is a patient architect, and it had rebuilt this house in its own image. Clara's arrival was a quiet disruption, a stone tossed into a frozen pond. The staff watched her with wary, skeptical eyes. They had seen the governesses come and go. They had seen the Duke retreat further into his own Arctic solitude. They saw a young woman in a plain traveling dress, whose title had been acquired in a manner that was the subject of rampant, fevered gossip below stairs, and they waited for her to fail. Her first act was not to sweep through the house issuing orders. It was to walk its halls, to listen. She walked with a small notebook, her steps quiet on the marble floors. She noted the drafts that snaked under the doors, the way the housemaid hands were chapped raw from the harsh lye soap, the low supply of firewood in the bins. She was not playing at being a duchess. She was assessing a patient. And she went to the East Wing. The Duca's man, Fletcher, a butler who had served his father, unlocked the doors for her with a funereal solemnity. The air that met them was stale, thick with the scent of dust and disuse. Everything was shrouded in holland covers, the furniture looming like pale ghosts in the gloom. The only light came from the slivers that pierced the edges of the heavy velvet curtains. Clara did not speak. She moved to the nearest window, and, with a grunt of effort, pulled the curtains back. Dust motes danced in the sudden shaft of pale sunlight, a blizzard of tiny forgotten moments. The light fell across a room that had once been beautiful. The silks on the walls were faded, the gilt on the chairs tarnished. There was a faint, persistent scent of damp. His Grace said it was to remain closed. Fletcher said, his voice stiff with disapproval. His Grace said, his late wife had a fondness for the morning sun in this wing. Clara corrected him gently. It seems a poor way to honor her memory to keep it in darkness. She ran a finger over a dusty windowsill, leaving a clean line. She wrote her own name in the dust, a fleeting silent declaration. Clara. Then she wiped it away. She was not here to replace, but to restore. Her introduction to Arthur was no less challenging. She found him, not in the nursery, but in the vast, cold library, curled in a window seat, a book, open but unread on his lap. He was a small pale copy of his father, with the same serious gray eyes and a stubborn set to his small mouth. He looked at her as she entered, his gaze flat and hostile, and then deliberately looked away, out at the bleak winter garden. She did not rush to him. She did not coo or cajole. Every instinct of the failed governesses had been to fill his silence with noise. Clara respected it. She browsed the shelves, pulling down a heavy volume on architecture. She sat in a chair not far from him, close enough to be a presence, but far enough not to be an intrusion, and she began to read. For an hour the only sounds were the whisper of turning pages and the ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall. Arthur did not move. He did not speak, but he was aware of her. She could feel his awareness like a pressure in the room. He was waiting for her to make a demand, to force a response to fail as the others had. She did not. When the light began to fail, she simply closed her book, stood, and placed it back on the shelf. As she reached the door, she paused. It is a common belief that a house grieves with its inhabitants, is it not? She said to the air. Perhaps that is why it has grown so cold. She left without looking back. The Duke Crispin watched her from a distance. He had made a bargain born of desperation and a strange, impulsive flicker of admiration. He was not yet certain if it had been a wise one. He saw her with the housekeeper, her head bent over the ledgers, asking quiet, intelligent questions. He saw her speaking with the head groom about the health of the horses. He saw her sitting in the library, a silent sentinel near his silent son. She did not seek him out. She did not flutter or demand his attention. She moved through his life with a quiet competence that was both unsettling and deeply calming. She was winding the clock of his house, and he found himself listening for the tick. One evening he found her in the kitchens, long after most of the staff had retired. A young scullery maid, little more than a child, had sliced her hand badly on a broken piece of crockery. The girl was crying, more from fear than pain. Clara was there, her sleeves rolled up, her expression calm. She was cleaning the wound with a soft cloth and warm water, her touch gentle. "And now it is not so bad, is it, Mary?" she was saying softly. "At a clean cut is the best kind. Well, bind it up, and you will have a fine story to tell tomorrow." She glanced up and saw him standing in the doorway. Her expression did not change. There was no flush of embarrassment at being found in the kitchens, no apology in her eyes. She simply met his gaze, a quiet challenge in it, as if daring him to object to this breach of protocol. He said nothing. He simply watched as she expertly wrapped the gorilla's hand with a strip of clean linen, her movements deft and reassuring. When she was done, she gave the girl a small pat on the shoulder. "Off to bed with you. No more washing up tonight." The girl scurried away, casting a terrified glance at the Duke. Clara turned and began to wash her own hands in the basin. "The housekeeper is capable of dressing wounds, Your Grace," she said, not looking at him. Have no doubt," he replied, his voice rougher than he intended. "I also have no doubt that the housekeeper's touch would not have been as kind." She finally turned to face him. Wiping her hands on a towel, "A kindness costs nothing. Some would disagree," he said, thinking of his father, who had seen kindness as a currency to be hoarded, a weakness to be exploited. "Then they are poor accountants," she said simply. She moved to pass him, to return to the formal upper regions of the house. He found himself stepping into her path. He had not intended to. His body had moved before his mind had. She stopped, her head tilted up to look at him. In the warm, flickering light of the kitchen, she looked tired. The weight of his house, of his son, of his title, was already settling on her small shoulders. Did not expect it," he began, and then stopped, unsure what he did not expect, that she would be so capable, that she would be so kind, that she would fit into the cracks of his broken life so perfectly. You did not expect me to be useful," she finished for him, a faint, wry twist to her lips. Do not worry, Your Grace. It is a common misconception." Before he could form a reply, She had slipped past him and was gone, her quiet footsteps fading down the stone corridor. He remained in the warm, empty kitchen, the scent of herbs and baking bread suddenly alien in his cold, silent world. He had bought a duchess, a solution to his problems. But he was beginning to suspect he had acquired something else entirely, something he did not know how to manage and was terrified to need. The thaw did not come as a flood, but as a slow, almost imperceptible, melting at the edges. It began, as all things at Harrowmere seemed to, with the East Wing. Clara had spent a week there, her notebook in hand, tracing the source of the damp that clung to the air and bloomed in faint, ghostly patches on the silk-paneled walls. She was not a lady idly inspecting her domain. She was a general studying a battlefield. She brought her findings to the Duca's study one evening. He was drowning in paperwork, the details of a tenant dispute on one of his northern properties. He looked up as she entered, a faint irritation in his eyes at the interruption. Your Grace," she began, laying a series of sketches on his desk. They were not artistic, but they were clear and precise. Of the East Wing. The damp is not from the ground, as the staff believes. It is from the roof. The lead flashing around the main chimney stack has pulled away, and there is a series of cracked tiles along the northern pitch. And this she pointed to another sketch, a cross-section of the wall. The water is running down inside the wall cavity, and pooling here, it is rotting the structural timbers. It is not a matter of aesthetics. In another few winters that part of the roof could collapse. Crispin looked from her sketches to her face. Her expression was serious, her finger tracing the lines she had drawn. This was not a complaint. It was a diagnosis. "And your recommendation?" he asked, his voice carefully neutral. A full repair before the next heavy rains. "I have spoken to the estate manager. There is a man in the village, a Mr. Giles, whose family have been slaters for 100 years. He is reliable. I have also procured an estimate for the timber replacement from the carpenter. Here are the costs." She placed a single sheet of paper on top of the sketches. It was a neat column of figures, meticulously calculated. "If we use our own timber from the West Wood, we can reduce the cost by nearly a third." He stared at the paper. It was the most sensible, practical, and well-thought-out proposal that had been put before him in years. The governesses had complained of the cold. The trustees had wrung their hands about neglect. Clara had found the cause and proposed a solution. "See to it," he said, his voice gruff. "You have the authority?" A faint smile touched her lips, the first genuine one he had seen. "Thank you, Your Grace." The work began the next week. The sound of hammers on the roof of the East Wing was a strange, alien noise in the profound silence of Harrowmere. It was the sound of something being mended. Arthur heard it too. Clara would often see him from the window, a small, solitary figure standing on the edge of the great lawn, staring up at the men on the roof. He never came closer, but he watched. One afternoon, Clara was in the East Wing's dusty drawing room, supervising the careful removal of a large tarnished mirror. Tucked behind it, caught between the frame and the wall, was a small, flat object. She opened it carefully. Inside, perfectly preserved, was a single purple viola, its color still vibrant. She knew, with a certainty that went straight to her heart, that it had belonged to the late Duchess. A small, forgotten piece of a life cut short. She did not throw it away. She took it to a local artisan and had it set under glass in a small, simple silver frame. A few days later, she found Arthur again in his window seat in the library. This time she approached. She held out the small silver frame. "I found this," she said quietly. "I thought you might like to have it." He looked at the frame, his eyes widening as he saw the flower. He reached out a small, trembling hand and took it. He traced the shape of the viola through the glass. "A pansy," he whispered, his voice rusty from disuse. She called them Hearthazies. It was the first time he had spoken to her, not just a word, but a sentence, a memory. Clara's own heart felt tight in her chest. Etaz, a beautiful name for them, she said, her own voice not quite steady. He looked up at her, his gray eyes, so like his father's, searching her face. He was looking for a trick, for a demand. He found none. He saw only a woman who had saved something precious instead of discarding it. He clutched the small frame to his chest and said nothing more. But he did not turn away. He let her stay. The true turning point came with the storm. It broke at dusk, a furious late autumn gale that threw sheets of rain against the great windows of the house and howled in the chimneys. Clara was in her rooms, reading, when a frantic knock came at her door. It was Mary, the scullery maid, her eyes wide with panic. Etaz, the nursery, your grace. The roof, Ida's, leaking. Clara was on her feet in an instant. She found the nursery in chaos. A steady drip of water was falling from the ceiling directly over Arthur's bed, soaking the coverlet. The two nursery maids were flapping uselessly, unsure what to do. Arthur himself was standing in the corner, his face pale, watching the water, as if it were a monster come to claim him. Buckets, Clara said, her voice cutting through the panic. And towels. Mary, help me with the bed. She did not wait for help. She began pushing the heavy child's bed across the room, away from the leak. The wood screeched in protest against the floorboards. Just as she was straining with the weight, another pair of hands joined hers. Strong hands. The Duke, he had come to find his son, drawn by the storm, and had found this scene of quiet, controlled crisis. He did not speak. He simply put his shoulder to the bedpost and helped her move the heavy piece of furniture to a dry corner of the room. Together they worked. They placed buckets to catch the drips. They mopped the floor with towels. The nursery maids, shamed into action by their example, scurried to help. Through it all, Arthur watched them, his expression unreadable. When the immediate crisis was over, the room was a mess of buckets and damp cloths. But the bed was dry and safe. The maids took a sleepy Arthur to prepare him for bed. Clara and the Duke were left standing in the middle of the damp room, the storm still raging outside. This wing was supposed to have been repaired last year, he said, his voice raw with a self-reproach that went deeper than a simple leak. He looked at the drip, at the spreading stain on the ceiling. He looked like a king, surveying a breach in his fortress walls. Buildings are like people, Clara said softly. They have hidden weaknesses. You cannot blame yourself for what you did not know. Can it? He finally looked at her. And the mask of the cold, controlled Duke was gone. In its place was a man who was exhausted, lost, and achingly lonely. My wife, she caught a chill in this house. It went to her lungs. She was never strong after Arthur's birth. I should have made the house warmer, safer. The confession hung in the air between them, a devastating admission of guilt and grief. He had not failed because he was cold. He was cold because he believed he had failed. You cannot command the damp out of the walls any more than you can command the grief out of a heart. Your Grace, she said, her voice filled with a compassion that startled them both. You can only do the work. One stone, one timber, one day at a time. He stared at her, at this woman he had brought into his house as a solution, a transaction. This woman who saw the rot in his walls and the guilt in his soul, and was not afraid of either. He had thought he needed a duchess. He was beginning to understand that he needed Clara. The realization was terrifying. It felt like a crack in the ice that had encased his heart for 2 long years. And he did not know if the thaw would save him or drown him. The arrival of the legal papers was a cold, hard slap of reality, shattering the fragile warmth that had begun to seep into the corners of Harrowmere. They were delivered by a grim-faced clerk from London, bound in ribbon, and they felt as heavy and final as a death warrant. Crispin read them in his study, the crisp parchment crackling in his hands. A petition had been filed with the Lord Chancellor. His late wife's parents, the Baron and Baroness Vane, were suing for custody of their grandson, Arthur. The grounds were a litany of carefully constructed cruelties. that the Duke was a cold and neglectful father, that Harrowmere was a dangerously unhealthy residence, that his sudden and unseemly marriage to a woman of no standing or fortune proved his instability and poor judgment. They painted Clara as an opportunistic adventuress who had preyed on a grieving man. The petition was peppered with sworn affidavits from a concerned parties. Crispin recognized the venomous hand of Lady Beatrice in the phrasing of one, which described Clara as a manipulative and grasping nobody. The gossip from the ball had been weaponized. His own aloofness, his grief, had been twisted into a narrative of neglect, and his marriage to Clara, the very thing he had done to secure his household, was now being used as the primary evidence against him. A cold, familiar fury rose in him. It was the same fury he had felt standing over her ruined dress in the ballroom, the same rage at the casual, smiling cruelty of the world. But this was worse. This was not about a spilled drink. This was about his son. He retreated. It was his oldest, most ingrained instinct, learned at the knee of a father who punished any display of emotion. When threatened, he became ice. He locked himself in his study, sending for his solicitor, communicating with the household through terse notes delivered by Fletcher. He did not speak to Clara. He could not. To look at her was to see the epicenter of the disaster. Not her fault, his mind told him, but his heart, terrified and raw, saw only the woman whose presence had brought the Vanessa simmering resentment to a boil. He had brought her into his life to protect his son, and in doing so had placed him in greater peril than ever before. To Clara, his withdrawal was a door slamming shut, plunging her back into the cold she thought she had begun to escape. The tentative connection they had forged in the leaking nursery, the shared moments of understanding, all of it vanished. The Duke was once again a remote, unreadable figure, and the silence that emanated from his study was more damning than any accusation. The whispers of the staff, which had softened to grudging respect, sharpened again to suspicion. They saw the grim-faced men of law coming and going. They saw the Duchess, pale and strained, moving through the halls like a ghost. They saw the master locked away. They drew their own conclusions. The words he had spoken at the ball returned to her, an insidious echo in the quiet of her mind. She wanted to be remembered here. It had been a prophecy after all. She was temporary, a failed experiment. When the trustees and the courts were done, he would cast her aside. She had been a fool to hope for anything more, a fool to believe that opening a few curtains could let the sun into a house and a heart so. Determined to remain in shadow, she had made her bargain, and now the price was coming due. She tried to continue her work. She oversaw the final repairs to the East Wing's roof. She managed the household accounts with a fierce, desperate precision, as if perfect order in the ledgers could somehow impose order on the chaos of their lives. But her heart was not in it. She was waiting for the axe to fall. She saw the fear in Arthur's eyes, too. He was a sensitive boy attuned to the emotional weather of the house. The new coldness emanating from his father's study frightened him. He became more silent than ever, clutching the small silver frame with his Madeira's flower as if it were a talisman. He would look at Clara with a question in his eyes. She could not answer. "Are you leaving too?" One afternoon, unable to bear the oppressive silence of the main house, she sought refuge in the East Wing. The repairs were complete. The air was clean and dry, smelling of fresh plaster and beeswax. The new Duchess, the woman who was about to be cast out, had at least accomplished this. She had mended one part of the broken house. She found the Duke there. He was standing in the center of the drawing room, staring at the space on the wall where the great mirror had been. The wall behind it, now free of damp, had been repapered in a silk that was a close match to the original. He did not hear her enter. It looks," he began, speaking to himself. "A lighter, the old paper, had absorbed years of smoke and damp," she said, her voice quiet. He started, turning to face her. The look on his face was one of she had not seen before. "Hunted. You should not be here," he said, his voice harsh. This is my house, Your Grace. For now, she replied, the last words barely a whisper. Where else should I be? This is my fault, he said, gesturing around the room, at the whole house, at the mess of their lives. I brought you into this. I exposed you to their venom. I have put my son at risk. The Vanes have wanted a reason to interfere for 2 years, she countered, finding a spark of her old fire. You did not give them a reason. Do not blame yourself for their avarice. And what of you? He demanded, taking a step toward her. Your name is being dragged through the mud in every drawing room in London. Your aunt is telling anyone who will listen that you are a whore and a trickster. When this is over, what will be left for you? She won't be remembered here. The words were a silent scream in her head. He was already planning for her departure. My reputation was of little value when you found me, she said, her voice trembling despite her best efforts. I imagine it will be worth much the same when you are finished with me. The cruelty of her own words hung in the air. She saw him flinch as if she had struck him. He opened his mouth to speak, to protest, but no words came. What could he say? That he would protect her? He could not even protect his own son. That he cared for her? The lie would have choked them both. He simply turned and walked away, leaving her alone in the bright, clean, empty room. The silence he left behind was worse than the silence that had been there before. It was a silence, full of things unsaid, of hopes dashed, of a future that was dissolving before her very eyes. She wrapped her arms around herself, a poor substitute for the warmth of his coat on that first night. The house was mended, but the family was breaking. The threat was no longer just a legal document. It was a chasm opening between them, and she was terrified she was about to fall into it alone. The custody hearing was held not in a public courtroom, but in the formal, wood-paneled chambers of the Lord Chancellor himself. It felt less like a trial and more like an execution. The air was thick with the scent of old leather and smug certainty. Baron Vane and his wife sat with their solicitor, their faces masks of sober concern that Clara knew was entirely false. Across the room, Lady Beatrice was seated, a viper in mourning clothes, ready to strike. Crispin sat beside Clara, a rigid statue of ducal pride. He had not spoken a word to her all morning. They were a united front in name only. Between them lay a frozen sea of fear and unspoken accusations. Clara felt fragile, as if she might shatter at a harsh word or a cold glance. The Vanessa solicitor, a man with a voice as smooth and oily as his hair, began. He painted a masterful picture of Harrowmere as a place of Gothic gloom and dangerous neglect. He spoke of a father too lost in his own grief to care for his child, a duke who allowed his ancestral home to fall into ruin. He produced an affidavit from one of the dismissed governesses, describing Arthur as a morose and unnaturally silent child, clearly suffering from a lack of maternal affection. Then he turned his attention to Clara. And into this sad state of affairs, my lords, enters a Miss Ashford, a woman of no family, no fortune, and no connections. A woman found in a state of public disgrace by the Duke, who, in a move that shocked all of society, married her in a hasty, secret ceremony. He let that hang in the air. One might ask, what were her motives? What were his? One cannot help but conclude this was an act not of prudence, but of desperation, and this woman, an adventuress of the first order, ill-suited to the sacred task of raising the heir to a great dukedom, Lady Beatrice was called. She dabbed at her eyes with a lace handkerchief, and spoke of her a deep concern for her niece. A Clara was always ambitious, she said, her voice trembling with manufactured sorrow, and impressionable. I fear she saw the Duke's wealth and title and was blinded. She is not a bad girl, merely a weak one, entirely unfit for the responsibilities of a duchess and a mother. It was a brilliant performance. Clara felt the Rumass judgment settle on her heavy and suffocating. She was exactly what they said she was. a nobody who had gotten in over her head. Crispin's solicitor did his best to counter. He was a competent man, presenting Harrowmeria's accounts to show it was financially sound and arguing the Duca's right as a father, but it was dry and clinical. It had none of the emotional fire of the Vansa attack. The Lord Chancellor, an imposing man with a weary face, looked unconvinced. Then, Clara was called to speak. She rose, her legs unsteady. All eyes were on her. This was the moment. She was expected to defend herself, to weep, to protest her good character. She did none of those things. She looked at the Lord Chancellor, her gaze direct and steady. My lords," she began, her voice quiet but clear, carrying to every corner of the silent room. "I will not speak to my own character. You have heard testimony on that, and you will form your own judgment. I will speak instead of the East Wing at Harrowmere A." A murmur went through the room. The Vanessa solicitor looked confused. This was not in the script. When I arrived at Harrowmere, the East Wing was closed. Clara continued, her voice gaining strength. It was said to be damp and cold. It was where the late Duchess resided. It was where she caught the chill that ultimately led to her death. It was seen by some as evidence of the Duca's neglect. She paused, her eyes finding Crispin's. He was watching her, his face a mask of stone, but his eyes were pleading. "I am not an expert in grief, my lords, but I have some small knowledge of housekeeping. The damp was not from neglect. It was from a damaged roof and cracked, flashing around a chimney stack. The timbers were beginning to rot." She laid her small notebook on the table. Here are my notes. Here are the estimates from the slater and the carpenter. Here are the receipts for the work, which is now complete. The wing is dry. It is warm. The cause of the cold was structural, not emotional. A house is not a heart. It can be mended with timber and lead if one only takes the trouble to look for the source of the break. She looked at the Vansa too. Honor the dead is not to shutter the rooms in which they lived. It is to care for them, to keep them warm and filled with light. Then she turned her attention to the matter of Arthur. Of the affidavits you have heard describe the Duca's son as silent and morose. He is a child grieving his mother. His silence is not a symptom of neglect, it is a shield. He believes his mother died because the house was cold. He believes his father is to blame. What he needs is not a new mother to replace the one he lost. He needs permission to remember her. He needs to know his home is safe. Her voice softened. "I found a flower," his mother pressed. "I had it framed for him. I did not tell him to forget her. I helped him hold onto a piece of her. His silence is not emptiness. It is a room full of memories he is afraid to speak aloud. The remedy for that is not to remove him from his home, but to make him feel safe within it." She finished, her heart pounding. She had not defended herself. She had defended the truth of a leaking roof and a grieving boy. The Lord Chancellor was looking at her, his expression no longer weary but intensely focused. "You have made your point." "Your Grace," the Vansa solicitor, flustered, rose to call his final witness to Arthur Esteta, the boy's own physician. But before he could, a small, clear voice cut through the room. As she opened the curtains, every head turned. Arthur was standing by his father's chair. No one had noticed him rise. He was looking directly at the Lord Chancellor, his small face pale but resolute. My mother liked the sun in her rooms," he said, his voice stronger now, as she opened the curtains. He then turned his head and looked not at his father but directly at Clara. His hand, which had been clutching his father's sleeve, let go. He took a hesitant step toward her. He said, his voice for all the room to hear. He held up the small silver frame he had kept with him all this time. And she mended the roof. It was the declaration, the unprompted, undeniable choice. It was not a child reciting a rehearsed line. It was a boy telling the truth as he knew it. This woman had not tried to erase his mother. She had honored her. She had brought back the light. The Venice case crumbled into dust. Lady Beatrice stared, her mouth agape, her performance utterly undone by the simple truth of a 7-year-old boy. Crispin rose to his feet. He placed a hand on his Suna's shoulder, a gesture of profound public pride. His eyes, when they met Clara's across the room, were no longer frozen. They were shining with a fierce, protective light that took her breath away. He looked at the Lord Chancellor. My wife has endured more than any woman should," he said, his voice ringing with an authority that was absolute. She has brought light and sense back into my house. This proceeding is an insult to her, to my son, and to the memory of my late wife. The matter is closed." "Ah!" The Lord Chancellor looked from the Duca's resolute face to the boy clutching his small, precious memory, to the woman who had spoken of mending houses and hearts. He nodded slowly. "Ah, indeed, Your Grace. The matter is closed." Udgling, a profound quiet settled over Harrowmere. It was not the cold, dead silence of before, but a peaceful, breathing stillness. The storm had passed. Clara stood before the fire in the main drawing room, staring into the flames. She felt hollowed out, exhausted. But for the first time in months, she was not afraid. She had spoken her truth. She heard footsteps and turned. Crispin stood in the doorway, watching her. He had shed the armor of the Duke. He was just a man, his face etched with weariness and a raw, unguarded emotion that made her heart ache. He came into the room and stood on the other side of the hearth. For a long time, neither of them spoke. The only sound was the crackle and hiss of the fire. My father taught me that feeling was a weakness," he said at last, his voice low and rough. He was a cold man, a cruel one. Any vulnerability was a weapon he could use against you, so I learned to show nothing. When she died, I built a wall of ice around myself. I thought it was strength. I thought it was what I had to do to protect my son. To protect myself. He looked at her, his gray eyes full of a pain he had never allowed himself to show. I was a coward, hiding in my grief. I let this house grow cold. I let my son grow silent. I failed them both. You were grieving," she whispered. "A grief is not a failing." "I know," he said. But fear is. And I was afraid. Afraid to let anyone in." He took a step around the hearth, closing the distance between them. "And then you came, and you were not afraid. Not of the cold, not of the silence, not of my Sona's grief. You walked into my frozen world, and you simply began to do the work. You opened the curtains." He was so close now, she could feel the warmth from his body. He reached out, not to touch her, but to gently finger the sleeve of her dress. That night, at the ball, when I said those words, she wanted to be remembered here. His voice broke on the memory of it. Was trying to shield you, to make them look away, to declare you insignificant, so they would leave you alone. It was the act of a fool and a coward. The cruelest thing I could have said, because it was the exact opposite of the truth of Saman. He finally met her eyes, and what she saw there made her breath catch. "From the moment I saw you, calming that servant, from the moment you met your aunt's cruelty, with that unshakable dignity, I knew. I knew I would never forget you. It terrified me." Tears pricked at Clara's eyes. She had held them back through humiliation and fear, but this raw, painful honesty threatened to undo her. Completely. "I do not say this out of gratitude, Your Grace," she managed, her voice thick, "for the hearing, for Arthur. I do not want your gratitude." My name?" he said, his voice a low command. Is Crispin. And this is not gratitude." He reached up and gently brushed a tear from her cheek with his thumb. His touch was electric, a jolt of warmth against her skin. This is awe. This is watching a woman I try to use as a shield become a sword in her own right. This is realizing the bargain I made to save my house ended up saving my soul." He searched her face, his own expression, stripped bare of all artifice. "I love you, Clara, not as a duchess, not as a solution. As the woman who mended my house and my son and me, the woman who stayed." He leaned in then, and his kiss was not the practiced move of a duke. It was clumsy and desperate, and utterly devastatingly real. It was a confession, a surrender, a promise. It was the sound of the ice finally, irrevocably breaking. When she kissed him back, it was not as a companion, or a bargain, or a duchess. It was as a woman who had, against all odds, found her way home. A year later, the East Wing was the heart of Harrowmere. The sun, which Clara had commanded back into the rooms, now streamed through clean windows, falling on warm rugs and comfortable well-used furniture. The scent of beeswax and lemon oil had replaced the smell of damp and dust, and most remarkably, the halls were filled with the sound of a childish laughter. Crispin found Clara in the newly finished library of the wing, a room that had once been shrouded in ghostly dust covers. She was on a small ladder, arranging books on a high shelf, a faint frown of concentration on her face. She was wearing a simple morning dress of deep blue, the color of a summer sky, and to him, she had never looked more beautiful. He watched her for a moment. This woman who had so quietly and completely remade his world. He had thought he was offering her a sanctuary, and all along, she had been building one for him. A small whirlwind of energy burst into the room. Mama, Arthur, his cheeks rosy with health, his gray eyes bright with life, skidded to a halt at the bottom of the ladder. He looked up at Clara, his face expectant. Clara looked down, her expression softening into a radiant smile. The title, Ah, Ma, Ah, had come tentatively at first, a whispered question, a few months after the hearing. Now, it was as natural as breathing. What is it, my love? A Fletcher says the pony is ready. Will you come and see me ride? Papa said I could try the small jump today. Will be down in just a moment, she promised. Arthur gave a whoop of delight and raced out again, his footsteps echoing cheerfully down the corridor. Clara started to climb down the ladder, but Crispin was there, his hands closing around her waist to lift her the last few feet to the ground. He did not let go, immediately holding her close, breathing in the faint scent of lavender that always clung to her. He adores you, Crispin said, his voice quiet against her hair. We adore each other, she corrected him softly, leaning back against his chest. And yet it was the most profound truth in his world. He had thought family was something you inherited, a name, a title, a house. She had taught him it was something you built, day by day, with patience and kindness and courage. As she left to go to their son, Crispin's eyes fell upon the main doorway of the wing. 2 craftsmen had been there that morning, and now, gleaming in the sunlight, was a newly installed brass plaque. It was small, elegant, and perfectly lettered. It did not say the East Winga, it said the Clara Winga. He thought back to his own arrogant, foolish words, spoken in a crowded ballroom in another lifetime. She will not be remembered. Hear how wrong he had been. She was not just remembered, she had become the memory. The house would now keep forever. Her name was carved into its walls. Her light was in its windows. She was the one who had stayed,